Imagine a winter evening when nothing dramatic appears to be happening. No riots, no headlines screaming collapse. Just ordinary people returning home after long days of work, believing that effort still means something, believing that tomorrow will be slightly better than today. This belief did not disappear overnight. It was carefully dismantled, piece by piece, until working hard stopped being a path to stability and became merely a way to survive one more month. For most of modern history, the relationship between work and stability was simple and brutally clear. You exchanged time and effort for income. That income paid for shelter, food, education, and a modest future. You were not promised wealth, but you were promised predictability. Stability was not luxury, it was the baseline. And because that baseline existed, societies functioned. People planned families, careers, and communities around the assumption that effort had meaning beyond the next paycheck. This assumption is now breaking down, not because people became lazy, and not because productivity collapsed, but because the structure connecting work to security was quietly redesigned. The modern worker still shows up, hours are longer, skills are higher, output is greater, yet stability feels farther away than it did decades ago. This contradiction is not accidental, it is structural. To understand how this happened, we need to move slowly, because this is not a story of sudden theft. It is a story of gradual disconnection. The first crack appeared when wages stopped growing in line with productivity. For decades after the Second World War, productivity gains and wage growth moved together. When workers produced more value per hour, they were paid more per hour. This was not generosity. It was necessity. Employers needed labor, governments needed social stability, and growth depended on a middle class that could actually consume what it produced. Then something changed. Productivity kept rising, but wages flattened. The gap between what workers produced and what they were paid widened year after year. This gap did not disappear. It was redirected. It flowed upward into profits, executive compensation, asset appreciation, and financial markets. Workers were told to be patient. Growth, they were assured, would eventually trickle down. It did not. At the same time, the costs that defined stability began to rise faster than wages. Housing shifted from shelter to investment. Education shifted from public good to private burden. Healthcare shifted from protection to risk. Each shift was justified individually, framed as efficiency, modernization, or choice. Together, they formed a system where the essentials of stability became increasingly expensive relative to income. This is where the psychological damage begins. When effort no longer guarantees security, people internalize failure. They assume the problem is personal. They work harder. They take extra jobs. They sacrifice rest, health, and time. But the math does not change. When wages lag and costs surge, effort alone cannot close the gap. The system requires something else from workers. Debt. Debt became the substitute for stability. When wages could not support housing, credit stepped in. When education became unaffordable, loans replaced grants. When healthcare costs spiked, payment plans replaced coverage. Debt did not solve instability. It postponed its consequences. It allowed people to appear stable while becoming more fragile underneath. This fragility is crucial to understand. A stable life can absorb shocks. A fragile life cannot. When rent consumes half of income, a single emergency becomes a crisis. When savings disappear, risk becomes terrifying. Workers become less mobile, less demanding, and more compliant. This is not an accident. Fragility is functional. It keeps labor disciplined without force. Another layer of instability came from the transformation of work itself. Jobs that once offered long-term security were rebranded as inefficient. Permanent employment was replaced with contracts, gigs, and flexibility. Flexibility sounds empowering, but in practice it shifted risk from institutions to individuals. Employers gained adaptability, workers absorbed uncertainty, benefits disappeared, predictable schedules vanished, planning became impossible. This transformation was sold as progress. Technology, we were told, made old models obsolete. Yet technology increased productivity dramatically. The wealth created by this productivity did not vanish. It concentrated. Risk, meanwhile, spread downward. Workers were no longer protected by institutions. They were expected to self-insure against volatility using stagnant wages. As stability eroded, culture adjusted to normalize it. Hustle replaced security as a moral ideal. Working multiple jobs was reframed as ambition. Burnout was reframed as weakness. Financial anxiety became background noise. People were taught to manage symptoms instead of questioning causes. Budget better, upskill constantly, optimize every moment. These strategies help individuals survive, but they leave the system untouched. The system depends on this framing. If instability is seen as personal failure, it is politically invisible. Collective solutions become unnecessary. Structural reform becomes unthinkable. Workers blame themselves instead of the architecture surrounding them. This is perhaps the most effective mechanism of control, convincing people that systemic outcomes are personal shortcomings. The financial system reinforced this logic. Asset ownership became the primary path to security. Those who owned homes, stocks, or businesses saw wealth grow through appreciation rather than labor. Those who did not were left chasing rising costs with flat incomes. The divide between owners and workers widened, even as many workers were encouraged to believe they were temporarily embarrassed owners in waiting. Inflation played a subtle role here. While wages stagnated, asset prices surged. Inflation did not affect everyone equally. Those with assets benefited. Those dependent on wages suffered. The result was a quiet transfer of purchasing power upward. Working harder did not protect against this transfer. It often intensified exposure to it. At the same time, public institutions that once buffered instability weakened. Social safety nets were trimmed. Labor protections were eroded. Collective bargaining declined. Each change was framed as necessary for competitiveness. Together, they removed counterweights that once linked work to dignity and security. The modern worker is therefore caught in a paradox. They are more productive than ever, yet more anxious, more educated, yet more indebted, more connected, yet more isolated. The promise that hard work leads to stability was not broken by chance. It was replaced by a different promise. Work hard enough, and you might avoid falling further behind. This is a crucial shift. Stability used to be the expected outcome of participation. Now it is a conditional reward, reserved for those who successfully navigate a maze of rising costs, financial risks, and institutional withdrawal. The maze is not designed to be completed by everyone. It is designed to sorting creates winners and losers without appearing cruel. The winners attribute success to merit. The losers attribute failure to themselves. The system remains unquestioned. Meanwhile, the relationship between effort and outcome continues to weaken. Understanding this does not mean rejecting work. It means rejecting the myth that work alone can deliver stability within a structure designed to extract value upward. Hard work still creates value. The question is who captures it. In the current system, capture is increasingly disconnected from contribution. The quiet truth is this: stability did not disappear because people stopped working hard. It disappeared because the mechanisms that once translated effort into security were dismantled and replaced with systems that reward ownership, leverage, and scale over labor. And once that translation is broken, no amount of individual effort can fully restore it. The problem is not motivation. It is architecture. The promise failed not because workers did, but because the system no longer requires their stability to function. The story does not end here. It cannot, because instability is not sustainable forever. But to understand what comes next, one must first see clearly how we arrived here, how effort was separated from security, and why working harder became the wrong answer to the right question. Why working harder became the wrong answer to the right question. The next phase of this story begins where discomfort turns into normalization. Once instability becomes familiar, people stop treating it as a crisis and start treating it as a condition of life. This is the most dangerous moment for any economic system, because suffering that feels inevitable no longer provokes resistance. It produces adaptation. And adaptation is exactly what the modern economy demands from labor. When stability vanished, something else quietly took its place: constant exposure to risk. Risk that used to belong to employers, governments, and institutions was transferred downward. Retirement became self-managed. Healthcare became conditional. Housing became speculative. Even income itself became variable. The worker was no longer just selling labor. The worker was absorbing volatility on behalf of the system. This shift fundamentally altered behavior. A person who lives with constant financial uncertainty does not negotiate aggressively. They do not take long-term risks like starting families or changing careers. They prioritize short-term survival over long-term planning. This is not irrational. It is a rational response to an unstable environment. But it also serves the system remarkably well. A workforce under pressure is flexible. A workforce without buffers is compliant. A workforce living paycheck to paycheck cannot easily say no. This is why instability is not merely tolerated but engineered. It disciplines labor without the need for force. It keeps productivity high while expectations remain low. At the same time, narratives evolved to justify this reality. Economic insecurity was reframed as opportunity. Volatility was rebranded as dynamism. Stability was portrayed as outdated, even lazy. Those who struggled were told they lacked adaptability. Those who succeeded were celebrated as proof that the system still worked. Survivorship bias replaced structural analysis. Technology accelerated these dynamics. Automation and digital platforms increased efficiency but also fragmented work. Tasks were unbundled, careers were atomized, workers competed globally, not locally. Bargaining power eroded further. The gains from efficiency accumulated at the top, while competition intensified at the bottom. Crucially, this was not experienced as a single shock. It unfolded gradually, year after year. Each change seemed manageable on its own. A little more rent, a little more debt, a little less security. Over time, the cumulative effect became overwhelming, but no single moment felt revolutionary enough to demand collective action. Inflation amplified this process, not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the slow, persistent kind that erodes purchasing power quietly. When prices rise faster than wages, effort loses value over time. Saving becomes harder, planning becomes unreliable. The future feels closer and more fragile. Those who own appreciating assets are protected from this erosion. Their wealth adjusts automatically. Those who rely on wages are exposed. They must constantly renegotiate their standard of living downward. This is how inflation quietly redistributes stability upward without appearing to do so. Debt completes the cycle. It allows the system to function even as wages fail to support basic needs. Credit fills the gap between income and cost. But credit comes with conditions: interest, penalties, dependence. Debt ties the future to the present in ways that reduce freedom. It commits future labor to past expenses. A worker in debt cannot easily withdraw from unfavorable conditions. They must keep earning, regardless of quality, meaning, or sustainability. Debt transforms work from a choice into an obligation. This is not accidental. It is how instability is monetized. Over time, people begin to internalize these constraints as normal adulthood. Financial anxiety becomes background noise. Exhaustion becomes routine. The idea of stability feels almost unrealistic, even childish. People stop asking for security and start asking for coping strategies. This psychological shift is one of the most profound changes of the modern era. When people stop expecting stability, they stop demanding it. And when they stop demanding it, institutions stop providing it. The social contract erodes not through betrayal, but through quiet abandonment. None of this required a conspiracy. It required alignment. Incentives favored capital over labor. Policies followed incentives. Culture adapted to policy. Individuals adapted to culture. At each step, responsibility moved upward, while consequences moved downward. The result is a world where working harder often deepens exposure rather than providing protection. More hours mean more burnout. More income often means higher fixed costs. Promotions bring status but not security. The ladder still exists, but the ground beneath it is unstable. This does not mean effort is meaningless. It means effort alone is insufficient. Stability now depends less on how hard one works and more on where one stands within the system. Ownership matters more than labor. Leverage matters more than loyalty. Timing matters more than discipline. Understanding this reframes frustration. It shifts blame away from individuals and toward structures. It reveals why so many people feel trapped despite doing everything they were told. Education, hard work, responsibility, none of these failed. The promise attached to them did. The question then is not why individuals are struggling. The question is why a system that depends on their labor no longer depends on their stability. The answer lies in extraction. A system that can extract value without maintaining the well-being of its workforce will eventually do so. But extraction has limits. Instability accumulates pressure. Debt saturates productivity, stalls under burnout. Social trust erodes. The same mechanisms that suppress resistance also weaken resilience. A system optimized for short-term efficiency becomes brittle over time. History shows that such systems eventually face reckoning. Not always dramatic. Sometimes slow, sometimes quiet, but always consequential. Stability cannot be permanently removed from the foundation of society without consequences. What replaces the current arrangement is not yet clear. But one thing is certain. The old promise cannot be restored simply by telling people to work harder. The relationship between effort and security must be rebuilt structurally, not morally. Until that happens, individuals will continue to feel a growing disconnect between what they give and what they receive, and that feeling is not confusion. It is clarity. It is the recognition that the rules changed, even if no one announced it. Working hard no longer leads to stability because stability is no longer the goal of the system. Efficiency is, extraction is, control is. Stability, once a shared foundation, has become a privilege. And when stability becomes a privilege rather than a baseline, work stops being a path to security and becomes merely a means of endurance.